Mishmash!
Space Marines.
Hey everyone, it's Mishmash again, and today I'm bringing you a tutorial on the Angel's Resplendent. I've decided that since I have an excess amount of Space Marines that I wanted to do something similar to the older tutorials I watched growing up. I know there's no shortage of Space Marine painting tutorials on YouTube, but I feel like there's so many chapters that really don't get any love. There's so many Space Marine chapters I find that have very little images or any sort of reference material, but you look at their lore and it's surprisingly deep. I find this more enthralling than making my own Space Marine chapter. Having a decent amount of lore and just a few reference images at best, you can really take something and run with it. And that is exactly what I'm doing with the Space Marine chapter today. And the Angel's Resplendent are one of the coolest chapters I've found. And I'm not just saying that because they're orange. Okay, it's mostly because they're orange. But, yeah, it's because they're orange. Anyway, I'm gonna shut up, let's get into it. To start off, you can take a look at one of my shorts to see how to get this orange color. Or I could tell you now. All I did was Zenithal Prime and then spray over it using Magmadroth Flame. After your orange is done, I'm going to be using Black Legion over all the parts I want to be black. I found that recently I really enjoy using Black Legion as a precursor to any sort of black paint rather than doing too thin coats of any black acrylic. It leaves a much sleeker and smooth finish. You'll see that plenty of the orange shows through, and that's just fine. I'm going to be coating Vallejo model color black over all these areas. I find that Vallejo's black is much more preferable than Citadel's. I don't dislike a bad in black, I just don't like how glossy it is. I encourage anyone that's new to painting, try out Vallejo. I wouldn't say they're my favorite. I've still yet to find one painting brand that ticks all the boxes. I think every painting brand brings something to the table that outshines all the others. But if you had like a taser gun to my balls, I'd probably say Vallejo. Not really sure why I said that. Anyway, you'll probably notice that I got some black over the orange, and that's not the end of the world. We're going to be weathering this guy down anyway. But to fix up some of these areas, I'm going to be using White Scar very lightly, and then I'm going to be applying our Magmadroth Flame over the White Scar. As you can see, it's pretty seamless. I think it's important to understand that even though I've been painting as long as I have, I'm always going to mess up some aspect of a miniature. That isn't to say that once in a while I have a miniature that doesn't go perfectly, but I think it's important to understand that hobby painting comes with a lot of failure. I'm sure I've spouted this sentiment before, and I seem to do this almost every video, but you learn more through failure than you do success. I find that some of the best tutorials are the ones that showcase failure, ones where someone tries something new and it turns out to be a terrible idea. Anyway, back to the miniature. Here I'm using Feugan Orange, and I'm aiming this mostly into the recesses of the mini. As you can see, one way that I like doing recess shading is by using the tip of my finger to kind of wipe away the excess. I find that it adds kind of a gradient effect, and on top of it, it's just easier than using another brush in my opinion. Maybe it's not a great habit, but it's how I learned to paint. Here I'm using a sponge, and I'm going to be using 2 Thin Coats Orange Flare. The reason we're doing this is to add a chipping effect to the armor as well as highlight it. I also use this method in my short. For the most part, I'm aiming this more on the edges of the miniature, kind of trying to highlight it, but it's okay if you go for the more broad areas. We don't want to do too much of this, as the miniature will look completely destroyed, and that's just not what I want to go for. After you're satisfied with the amount of chips you've added to the mini, I'm going to start highlighting using a very thin brush. The way that I'm highlighting, especially for this beat up look, is a very flicky motion. You can see that I'm angling the miniature so I can use a flicking down motion when doing this. I find this method allows it to be much more comfortable on my wrist so I can do it more often. I also find that highlighting this way is much more accessible to new painters. Painting clean, thin lines for highlighting is something that I just don't care for overall, and it's not something that I expect somebody just getting into the hobby to get right away. Plus, clean, regaling Space Marines always bore me. It's like they never even got to the battlefield. Also, we're using Nuln oil to shade in the black. Just do a recess shade. If you do over the entire panel, it looks kind of weird. Here I'm using my thin brush to really strengthen the highlights by adding just a little bit more scratching to it. Making these streaky lines is a good way to add some character to the mini, as well as just adding more realism to it. He's going to be running through dangerous terrain, so it makes sense that he would be covered in scratches. Of course, all of this is optional, it's an extra mile. If you wanted, you could even call the orange tabletop ready. And to be honest, I really did go in excess with the amount of highlighting. The reason I'm going in such high detail is, well, for one, I really do enjoy painting Marines like this. I find it really fun, especially when you get to the end. But also, this is for a very small squad. I'm only doing 6 Marines overall. The methods I'm using to highlight and do all these extra mile things, it really should only be applied to hero characters if you just want to play the game. Hodgepodge made note of this earlier, but here I'm rebuilding a little bit more of that highlighting on the backpack and the black, using just a little bit of eshin gray. I will make note, this color scheme is kind of hard to capture on camera. I think it looks a little bit more vibrant than it really is in real life, but it looks just as fantastic here as it does in person. And I'm typically my own worst critic, but I can't deny that this paint scheme doesn't fit the setting perfectly. Here, I'm using rakarth flesh, and we're going to be base coating the purity seal. This is one of my favorite parts of painting Space Marines. Like I said earlier, you could totally stop for a tabletop standard, but I'm going to take this even further. I'm going to be using Fire Dragon Bright on the brightest edges of the highlights, and I'm going to be filling in all the chipping patterns that we made earlier with this color. It's better to use the brightest highlight possible on chipping effects, as it makes it stand out even more when you fill them in. And because I'm a frickin' goober, I decided to add just a little bit of dark sun yellow from 2 thin coats on the tiniest edges of the orange. Like I said, this is excessive. Here I'm using Dawnstone and I'm highlighting all the black. I'm essentially using the same methods as I did on the orange, except I'm not going in as much detail as it is a smaller part of the mini. For the bolt gun, I'm highlighting using dark gray from Vallejo model color. I think it looks better to do a different black on the bolt gun than it is to do the actual Marine. This is where the magic happens. We're now filling in all these chips using dryad bark and a little bit of black. Be careful not to make this color go outside of any of the chipping patterns, as it'll look kinda weird. Doing this effect really never gets old. It's one of the most therapeutic parts of painting to me. This effect takes a lot of time and effort, but man is it worth it. after having our fun, I'm now using a little bit of Iron Warriors, and I'm going to be base coating all the metallic areas. For the wax seal, I used a little bit of Vallejo model color burnt red. Here I'm going all over the miniature using a little bit of Nuln oil, getting it all over the metallics, and I'm just putting a little bit into the Aquila. You'll probably notice that I used a little too much, so I used a dry brush to soak up the excess. For the purity seal, I'm using a little bit of Vallejo Game Color Sepia ink, and I've watered it down just a little bit. As you can see here, I was a little fussy about how it settled in the recesses. Here's a pretty good guide on painting leather. Earlier we base coated this using Rinox hide, and now I'm adding in these scratchy highlights using a little bit of Doom Bull brown. This highlight is a bit thick, and the reason we're doing this and making these scratchy lines is it really is more of a stress line on the leather itself. I've talked about painting leather in previous tutorials, but this holster has a much more broad surface and it gives me a lot more room to really show you how to do this. For our second highlight, I'm going to be using Ratskin flesh mixed with our Doom Bull brown. It's about 50-50 as you can see, and we're going to be sketching this along the sides. We're focusing much more towards the edge of the leather, but we're also going to be doing that sketchy look. It needs to be just a little bit sporadic to look realistic. As a final highlight, I'm adding a little bit of Cadian flesh tone to that mixture that we had before, and this you want to be very sparing with. Basically just dot this on the sharpest highlights. For the purity seal, I'm using elfic flesh mixed with rakarth flesh. It's a lot of flesh, and I'm basically sketching these highlights across the parchment paper. Focus it thicker on more of the broader sections. For the wax itself, we're going to be using a little bit of pink horror mixed in with our burnt red, and we're going to be painting this broadly over all the flared edges of the wax. For the eyes, I'm sketching a thin line of 2 thin coats dark sun yellow. I'd also filled in the under part of the eyes using watered down moot green, just to give kind of a slight glowy effect. I think it worked out okay overall, but I typically don't take too many chances when painting Space Marine's eyes. Even with all my experience in the hobby, I find that having to repaint their eyes, it kind of looks obvious and it sort of irreparably damages the rest of the mini. For all the metal areas, I'm using Iron Warriors mixed with a little bit of Vallejo Game Color Silver Metallic. For the brighter edges, I'm using pure Vallejo Silver Metallic. Here, I'm very carefully filling in the eyes using Karandras Green. I'm finishing off the bolt gun casing using a little bit of Thunderhawk blue on the highest edges. To paint in writing on the purity seal, I'm using a little bit of Vallejo dark gray. And to finish off the purity seal, I'm using just a little bit of pink horror on the very tips, and I'm just speckling a tiny bit in the middle. I would call the miniature complete once I used my basing material, which is the exact same thing I did for the urban bases, check out those shorts, and I added some decals. Funny story about that too. You see, I ordered decal paper forever ago, and I never got around to using it until now. See, the one thing is I accidentally ordered decal paper with a white background, so I printed off the symbols for Angel's Resplendent, and they had white all over them. Even with all this mess up, I still tried applying my own decal, and I painted over it. I tried freehanding over the angel, but it just didn't work out. I then decided altogether that I was just going to paint over the shoulder and wait for some new decals to show up, which should be today. With this, I'm going to be showing you how to make decals on your own, and I'm going to be making a follow-up for this video, just showing off the Angel's Resplendent decal itself. Even with that little bit of failure at the end, I'm still really happy with how this mini turned out. I'm really excited to show you guys how to do the decal, and I'm going to be doing another Space Marine tutorial afterwards. Also, I'd like to mention that I really don't care for the Angel's Resplendent logo. I feel like the orange cloak makes him look kind of too orange, and on top of it, yeah, you can see what I'm talking about. Either way, I gotta get it right, so I'm going to be changing the orange color to blue, and that's all the changes I'm going to make. Hopefully that short will be out soon after this video posts, but for now, I ask you humbly, if you liked what you saw, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more, and mishmash, kit bash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna, I promise. See ya.